Lyra stood at the grand window of her chambers, gazing out at the alien landscape of her homeworld. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the distance, taking in the jagged mountain peaks and the shimmering cities below. The sky above was a deep violet, its twin moons casting long silver shadows across the land. Everything around her was perfect, beautiful, structured, and orderly. Everything but her thought she was to be married today, but not for love, not for any of the things that one might wish for in a union of two souls. No, Lyra's marriage had been arranged. A political alliance, a treaty between her people, the Talari, an advanced and proud race, and the humans of Earth, a species seen by many in the galaxy as primitive and uncivilized. Lyra's father had insisted that she marry Ethan Harper, a human from Earth. The treaty was meant to bring peace, and Lyra, as the daughter of the Talari leader, had a duty to fulfill her role no matter the cost. Her heart was cold at the thought of it. She had seen humans before. They were weak, brutish, their technology nowhere near that of the Talari. The idea of being bound to one of them in marriage made her stomach churn. She didn't know what to expect when she first saw Ethan in person, but it was certainly not the sight that greeted her. She had imagined him to be tall and muscular, like the gladiators from the stories. Instead, Ethan was, well, ordinary. He was shorter than most of the Talari, his clothes rough and simple, a far cry from the polished, elaborate robes of the highborn. His hair was dark, unkempt, and he looked out of place among the splendor of the palace. Yet it was not his appearance that made Lyra recoil. It was his presence. He didn't act like the others. He wasn't polite or dignified. He didn't bow, he didn't speak in formal tones. Ethan had an air of casual confidence, like someone who didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. And that infuriated Lyra. Do not look at him too closely, her mother had warned. He's just a tool. A piece on the board, nothing more. Do not let yourself feel anything for him. But it was hard not to, the way he smiled at her. Not in the practiced way her people did, but in an honest, unguarded way, was confusing. His eyes held no fear or awe of her status. He didn't bow when he first saw her, nor did he seem to be intimidated by the power she wielded as the daughter of the Talari leader. He simply stood there offering a small, quiet greeting. When the ceremony began, Lyra had expected everything to feel grand, to feel ceremonial, as it always did. But when Ethan held her hand, his touch was warm and genuine. It wasn't like the cold, distant touch of her fellow Talari. It was real. His hand didn't tremble in awe of her status, but instead it offered comfort. He didn't treat her like a princess or a trophy. He treated her like a person, and that was what frightened her. The ceremony itself was a blur. Words were exchanged, vows were made. The crowd cheered. But Lyra wasn't listening to any of it. She was too lost in her thoughts. Why was he so different? Why didn't he look at her as if she were some untouchable ruler? Why was he smiling so easily? Was it possible that he didn't fear her? When the ceremony was over, Lyra was escorted to the chambers that had been prepared for her and her new husband. The room was grand, like everything in the palace. Large windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below, its towering spires of glass and metal stretching up to the dark sky. Yet Lyra's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't understand why Ethan didn't act the way she expected. He was nothing like the men from her world. No one had ever dared to speak to her the way he did, without the awe, without the submission. Even her closest allies, her own people, had never treated her as an equal. They all saw her as the daughter of their leader, as someone who was important, untouchable. Ethan, however, didn't see her that way. The door to her chambers opened with a soft click, and she turned to see him standing there, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed casually. "I guess this is where we live now," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. Lyra said nothing. She only nodded, trying to compose herself. He didn't speak to her with formality. He didn't bow. He didn't wait for her to speak first. Instead, he walked in and casually sat on the couch as if he were at home. It was an attitude Lyra couldn't quite place. He had no sense of respect for her position, and yet there was no malice in him either. It was almost as if he didn't see her as anything other than a person. "I know this might be strange," Ethan said after a long pause, "but we'll make the best of it, right?" Lyra stared at him, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. There was no fear in his words, just a quiet acceptance of the situation. What makes you think I would want to make the best of this? Lyra asked, her voice icy, her eyes hard. Ethan met her gaze calmly, his expression unreadable. Because despite what you think, I'm not here to make your life worse. I don't want to control you or force you into something you don't want. We both have to be in this together. Lyra blinked, taken aback. That wasn't what she had expected to hear. She had assumed that he would try to manipulate her somehow, that he would try to use his position as her husband to gain power, but instead he was talking to her like an equal, as if they were teammates in this strange, uncomfortable situation. The room was silent for a moment, and for the first time since they had met, Lyra found herself unsure of how to feel. She wasn't sure if she was angry or confused or something else entirely, but it was the first time she felt something other than fear, resentment, or annoyance. There was a part of her, though small, that was intrigued. Ethan stood up after a few moments and walked toward the window, looking out at the world beyond. It's not going to be easy for either of us, but I think we can make it work, he said, his back to her. Lyra was about to speak to remind him of his place, to tell him how impossible it would be for her to ever accept this marriage. But before she could, he turned around and smiled at her again. It wasn't a smile of arrogance or superiority. It was just a smile. Simple, honest. Maybe we can be friends, he said quietly, before turning back to the view. Lyra stood frozen in place, the words lingering in the air between them. She didn't know what to think, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this human, this simple man from Earth, had just done something no one had ever done before. He had made her feel human. Days passed, and the grand palace where Lyra and Ethan lived remained as cold and impersonal as ever. Lyra spent most of her time in the quiet chambers, staring out at the vast landscapes of her homeworld, wondering if she would ever feel truly at peace in this strange marriage. The initial shock of the wedding had worn off, but the discomfort remained. She hadn't expected Ethan to act so normal, or perhaps more accurately, human. He was nothing like the polished, carefully controlled individuals from her world. She had imagined that a marriage to a human would be dull, unremarkable, or even unpleasant. But to her surprise, it was anything but that. It had been a week since the ceremony, and every day was a new experience. Ethan seemed to have no regard for the formalities that her people insisted on, and it bothered her at first. He would speak to her as though she were just another person, not the daughter of a leader, not a princess. But what bothered her more was the way he made her feel. In every conversation, in every glance, Ethan treated her as though she were something precious. He didn't care that she was the daughter of a powerful ruler. He didn't care about her royal blood or her people's status. He saw her for who she really was. One morning, Lyra was sitting in the gardens outside, taking in the soft breeze that swept through the trees. She didn't want to be here, but the garden had a strange calmness to it. It was the only place where she felt even a little bit of peace. She had just started to close her eyes when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan's voice was soft, though she could hear the faint curiosity in it. Lyra opened her eyes and turned her head slightly, giving him a quick glance. He wasn't wearing his formal attire today. Instead, he was in simple clothing, just a tunic and pants. He had that same casual air about him, as though nothing in the world could bother him. "Sure," she said, her voice cool and distant, though she couldn't help but wonder what he was doing here. Normally, he would be off doing something important, something political, something that involved his role as her husband. But today it seemed like he just wanted to talk. Ethan sat beside her, not too close, but not too far either. His presence was unintrusive, but she couldn't deny that it was a little comforting. "You've been here for a while, haven't you?" Ethan asked, his eyes scanning the garden. "Do you miss your home?" Lyra blinked. The question caught her off guard. Her home, her people, her world. It all felt so distant now. Yes, she missed it. But she couldn't admit that to him. It would make her seem weak. "It's not the same here," she replied, her tone neutral. "It's nothing like what I'm used to." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. But sometimes, you have to make the best of things, right? You can't always control where life takes you. But you can decide how you react to it." Lyra frowned at his words. They were so simple, yet so true. Ethan wasn't trying to make her feel better. He wasn't offering her empty promises. He was just telling her the truth in a way that only a human could. I suppose, Lyra said quietly, her thoughts swirling. But this is different. My life was decided for me before I was even born. I get that, Ethan said, his voice more serious now. But doesn't that make you want to change it? To have a choice for once. Lyra was silent for a moment. The question lingered in her mind. She had never really thought about it that way. All her life she had been raised to follow the path laid out for her. There was no room for choice. But hearing Ethan's words, seeing the quiet determination in his eyes, made her wonder if there was something more. Maybe, she whispered. Ethan looked over at her and smiled. That same simple, genuine smile that had been confusing her from the very beginning. Maybe we can find a way to make this work after all, he said softly. Not just because of the treaty, but because we choose to. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something inside her stirred. Was he suggesting that they could build something real? A marriage based on mutual respect and understanding? The thought seemed impossible. Yet there was something in Ethan's eyes that made her believe it might be possible, if only she could allow herself to believe it. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, lessons, and ceremonial events. But through it all, Lyra began to notice something new about Ethan. It wasn't just his honesty that stood out, it was his kindness. He didn't do things because he had to. He did them because he genuinely cared. One evening, as they sat in the palace hall, Ethan stood up to speak to a group of Talari officials. They had gathered to discuss matters of the Alliance. But Lyra could tell that some of the officials were uncomfortable with the idea of a human having a voice in such matters. The room was tense, filled with murmurs of discontent. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, steady gaze. He didn't raise his voice, but there was an authority in the way he spoke. We're all here for the same reason, Ethan said, his voice clear and strong. We're all here to create something better, something lasting. But if we don't work together, it will all fall apart. You may not like it, but that's the reality. Lyra watched as the Talari officials looked at him with surprise. For the first time, she saw the humans in a new light. They were underestimated, yes, but they were resilient. They fought for what they believed in, even when the odds were against them. Ethan didn't back down. He didn't try to placate the officials with sweet words or promises. He spoke the truth, and that truth was undeniable. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. After the meeting, Lyra found herself walking beside him in the palace corridors. She had a new sense of respect for him. Ethan was not the man she had first thought him to be. He was more than that. He was strong, not just in body, but in spirit. He had something that Lyra hadn't realized she needed. Courage. You handled them well, Lyra said quietly, her voice soft. Ethan shrugged, though there was a glint of pride in his eyes. It's not about winning every argument. It's about making sure the right thing happens. Lyra didn't say anything more, but she couldn't help but smile. She had always been taught that diplomacy was about control. Control over others, control over situations. But what Ethan had shown her was something entirely different. It was about honesty. It was about being true to yourself, even when the odds were against you. For the first time since her marriage to Ethan, Lyra began to feel something unexpected. It wasn't just respect for him, it was admiration. Maybe even something more. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Ethan was changing her perspective, and she wasn't as afraid of him as she used to be. That night, as they both sat in their chambers, Lyra glanced at Ethan. He was looking out the window, his gaze distant. "Do you ever miss Earth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned to her, his eyes softening. "I miss my family," he said quietly. "I miss the little things. But I'm here now, and I'll make the best of it just like you." Lyra nodded, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel so alone. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to this strange partnership after all. The days in the palace were growing longer, and Lyra's internal conflict was becoming harder to ignore. She had always been taught that humans were inferior, primitive, and unreliable. But every time she spent more time with Ethan, she saw the cracks in those beliefs. He was nothing like the picture she had been shown. Instead, he was strong, resilient, and kind. And there was something in him that made her wonder whether humanity had more to offer than the galaxy had given them credit for. However, peace in the galaxy was fragile. It was not just their union that had caused tension. It was the very fact that humans were part of this greater intergalactic treaty. There were factions who did not want humans involved, who saw their rise as a challenge to their power, and it was these factions that were now moving in the shadows, preparing to disrupt everything. It started with small, seemingly unimportant events. A few communications were interrupted. Ships disappeared without a trace. At first it seemed like a coincidence or perhaps the result of a simple misunderstanding. But Lyra's instincts told her otherwise. She could feel the tension rising in the air, even as she tried to stay focused on the everyday responsibilities of being the wife of a human. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Lyra found Ethan pacing the room. His face was tense, his expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping into the room and watching him closely. Ethan turned to her, his eyes sharp. "We've got trouble," he said. "I've been hearing rumors. There's a faction out there. Aliens who want to break the treaty. They think humans don't belong here and they're willing to do whatever it takes to stop us from having any real power." Lyra frowned, her heart pounding in her chest. "What kind of trouble?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he walked toward the window, staring out into the vast expanse of space. "I don't know yet, but I've heard whispers about ships disappearing, communications being cut off. This isn't just about politics anymore. Someone's making a move." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. For the first time, she saw the danger in their marriage, the danger in the peace they had built. She had known that their union was controversial, but she hadn't realized how far some would go to destroy it. "We can't let this go unnoticed," she said, her voice firm. "We need to act before it's too late." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes dark with determination. "I agree, but we can't fight this alone. We'll need help." Lyra nodded. She didn't need to be told twice. She had been raised in a world of power and influence, but Ethan was right. This was bigger than politics. They needed to find allies. For the next few days, Lyra and Ethan worked together, reaching out to the few factions that supported their union, trying to piece together information. Lyra found herself relying on Ethan's skills, his intuition, and his human approach to problem solving. His ability to read people, to know when someone was lying or hiding something, was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was raw, unpolished, but effective. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their chambers, Ethan looked at her with a mixture of worry and determination. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was to come. Lyra took a deep breath, her heart racing. "I have no choice. My people are at risk, and so are we." Ethan gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll face this together. You don't have to do it alone." His words, simple as they were, filled her with a sense of calm she hadn't expected. For the first time in their marriage, she truly believed him. He wasn't just a human trying to protect himself. He was standing by her, fighting for their future together. Over the next week, things began to escalate. The first major attack came without warning. Lyra was in the middle of a meeting when the palace's alarms blared, cutting through the air with a sharp, jarring sound. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood, her mind racing. "Lyra!" Ethan's voice echoed in the hallway, and she rushed toward him. He was already moving, pulling her toward a safe room. "We've been compromised. They're here." Lyra's pulse quickened. The sounds of blaster fire and heavy footsteps echoed through the halls. The palace was under attack. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her into the room and locking the door behind them. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "I need to go help." "No," Lyra said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm not staying here. I'm a part of this now. I'm not going to hide." Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew she was right. The moment the treaty had been signed, the moment their marriage had been arranged, they were both in this together. There was no going back. With a deep breath, he nodded. "All right, stick close to me." They moved quickly through the hidden corridors of the palace, Lyra's heart pounding in her chest. The sounds of the attack grew louder as they neared the outer walls. Lyra had never been in a real combat situation before. She had seen battles in the past, but from a distance. This was different. Ethan was calm, almost too calm. He moved with precision, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Lyra had always been taught that Talari were superior in combat, that their strength and agility would outmatch anyone, human or otherwise. But watching Ethan, she realized how wrong she had been. He didn't rely on brute strength. Instead, he used his intelligence and quick thinking. He knew how to outsmart their enemies, how to avoid danger. They reached the main chamber where a group of armed rebels had taken control. Lyra could hear them arguing, shouting orders in a language she didn't understand. Ethan turned to her. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "We'll take them by surprise." Lyra nodded, her heart racing but her determination growing. She had seen what Ethan was capable of, and now it was time for her to be just as strong. As they rounded the corner, they took the rebels by surprise. The human strength that Lyra had once thought of as weak was suddenly clear. Ethan's movements were swift, decisive. His every action was calculated and his strategy worked. The rebels were outnumbered, but they were no match for the combined force of Lyra's quick thinking and Ethan's resourcefulness. In less than an hour, the rebels were subdued and the palace was safe again. Breathing heavily, Lyra stood with Ethan, her pulse still racing. She looked at him, her heart filled with gratitude and something more. For the first time since their marriage, she truly saw him, not as a tool in a political game, but as a partner. "You were amazing," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan grinned, his eyes bright with pride. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" Lyra smiled back, the tension in her chest loosening. She realized in that moment that the fear she had once felt for Ethan had faded. What remained now was respect. And something more, something she wasn't ready to name yet, but something that was growing with every passing day. As they made their way back to their chambers, the palace slowly returning to normal, Lyra couldn't help but feel a new sense of hope. The future was uncertain, but with Ethan by her side, she knew they could face whatever came their way. The battle was over, but the palace still buzzed with the quiet hum of a tense peace. After the rebels had been dealt with, the once bustling halls of the royal residence felt strangely empty. The soldiers who had remained loyal to Lyra's family were now guarding the perimeter, ensuring that the threat had truly been neutralized. Still, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, that this was only the beginning. Ethan stood beside her as they surveyed the damage to the palace. She had always been taught that humans were unpredictable, dangerous in their simplicity, yet she had never imagined that Ethan, a man she once feared, would be the very person who protected her and her people. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the setting twin moons bathed the world in a soft glow. The peaceful landscape was a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. She turned to Ethan, who was standing with his arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, unsure if he would answer. After all, they had been through so much together in such a short time. Ethan gave her a small smile. "I'm good. A little tired, but I'll survive." There was something in his voice, something unspoken, that made Lyra feel like they were no longer just a political alliance. She wasn't just the daughter of a ruler, and he wasn't just a human from Earth. They were something more, partners in every sense of the word. "I'm glad you're okay," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile widened, though there was a tiredness behind his eyes. "I should be the one saying that to you. You were the one who led our people through that chaos." "You were brilliant," Lyra shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. We did it together." The truth of her words rang in her chest. It hadn't been just her leadership that had made the difference. It had been Ethan's strength, his quick thinking, and his ability to stay calm in the face of danger that had turned the tide. Together, they had made a real difference, not just in the battle, but in their growing connection as well. As the days passed, Lyra found herself looking at Ethan in a way she had never done before. She saw not just his physical strength, but his emotional intelligence. She noticed how he always looked out for others, how he never hesitated to help those in need regardless of their status. The more she saw, the more she realized how much she had misunderstood about humanity. Ethan wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader. He didn't lead through fear or authority, but through understanding and compassion. Every decision he made seemed to have a deeper purpose behind it. And the more she got to know him, the more she admired him. One evening, after another long day of talks and planning for the future of the Alliance, Lyra and Ethan found themselves alone in their chambers. The palace was quieter than usual, and for once, it felt like they could finally breathe without the weight of the galaxy pressing down on them. Ethan sat at the small table by the window, his fingers drumming lightly on the surface. Lyra could see that he was lost in thought, a distant look in his eyes. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Ethan," she said softly, walking over to him, I don't know if I've ever truly said it, but thank you. For everything. Ethan looked up, his expression softening. What do you mean? Lyra sat down across from him, her gaze never leaving his. For showing me what real strength is. For helping me realize that there's more to this than politics and power. Ethan smiled gently. I'm just doing what's right. And you've got more strength than you give yourself credit for. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. His words, simple as they were, meant more to her than she could express. There was no arrogance in him, no sense of superiority. He didn't treat her like a trophy, and he didn't expect anything from her. He saw her as an equal, and that was something she had never experienced before. As the conversation grew quieter, Lyra found herself leaning closer to him, drawn in by the warmth of his presence. She didn't understand it, but there was something between them, a connection that neither of them had expected but both of them had embraced. Ethan shifted slightly, his gaze dropping to the table, and Lyra couldn't help but notice how vulnerable he looked in that moment. It wasn't the confident leader she had come to rely on, but the man beneath it all, someone who was just trying to navigate the complexities of a world he didn't fully understand. I'm scared, Lyra admitted, her voice trembling slightly, not just for the future of my people, but for us. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with empathy. I get it. It's hard to trust people when everything in your life has been planned out for you. But we can't control everything. We can only control how we react. Lyra let out a small sigh, her shoulders relaxing. You're right. I've spent my entire life being told what to do, what to believe. But with you, it feels different. I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. Ethan smiled. That's the thing about us humans. We don't have all the answers, but we're pretty good at figuring things out as we go. Lyra couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and freeing. She had never imagined that she would feel this way, laughing with a human, sharing her thoughts and fears. But here they were, two people from vastly different worlds facing the unknown together. I never thought I'd say this, she said softly, her voice full of wonder. But I'm glad it's you I'm with. I'm glad it's you who's here by my side. Ethan's smile softened, his eyes holding a depth of emotion that made her heart skip. And I'm glad it's you. I can't imagine facing all of this with anyone else. For the first time since their marriage, Lyra didn't feel like she was trapped in a political arrangement. She didn't feel like a pawn in a game she couldn't control. In that moment, she felt something stronger, something real. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The galaxy outside might have been uncertain. The future might have been filled with unknown dangers. But Lyra knew one thing for sure, she wasn't alone anymore. Together, she and Ethan had created something that was stronger than any treaty, more enduring than any alliance. As they stood up to face the future, side by side, Lyra realized that their love, unpredictable, complicated and unexpected, was the one thing that could change everything. No longer did she fear the human she was forced to marry. Instead, she trusted him. And in that trust, she found something greater than she had ever imagined. Hope for herself, for Ethan, and for the future they would build together.